The Representation and Social Regulation of Women in Athenian Art of the 6th through 4th Centuries BCE, a thesis presentation by Elizabeth Summers. Observations of ancient Greek art and literature quickly reveal a distinct patriarchal social structure and the importance of maintaining power, themes which are heavily present throughout the whole of ancient Greek mythology, art, and society. Literary and artistic representations of goddesses, such as Aphrodite and Athena, were revered by ancient Athenians, Aphrodite for her sexuality, and Athena for her virginal commitment to order. However, these characteristics which were held in the highest regard were distinctly female, therefore still differentiating them from the more dominant ideal man. In the myth of Prince Orestes, son of King Agamemnon and Queen Clytemnestra, Orestes kills his own mother to seek revenge for her hand in Agamemnon's death. According to Aeschylus's Orestia, this enrages the three Furies, who subsequently take him before the goddess Athena for punishment. Athena grants Orestes a trial before 12 Athenian citizens, but when the Athenian vote results in a tie, Athena casts the deciding vote that Orestes will not be killed, stating, "I will add this vote of mine to Orestes, for there is no mother who bore me, and I honor the male in all things, except getting married, and I belong very much to my father. Thus I will not give preference to the fate of a woman who killed her man, the guardian of the palace. Orestes wins, even if the judgment is by equal vote." In this example, and throughout ancient Greek mythology, art, and literature, the othering and sometimes blatant degradation of women in favor of the ideal man remains prevalent. Women were intentionally represented as lesser than men in almost all depictions of daily life that range from lower-class sex workers to upper-class domesticated wives. The goddess sculptures and vase paintings of classical and Hellenistic Athens portrayed a new female ideal defined by the male expectations of the time, which then shaped standards of body, dress, and hygiene for women. Through the study of such artistic representation, alongside societal reaction and gender relations in Athens from the 6th through 4th centuries BCE, we can observe how sculpture and vase painting both reflected and furthered the social class divides of women in ancient Greece. Due to the transformation in styles of dress and body grooming, alongside characterized portrayals of women during each period, not only can one understand the social rank of each individual depicted, but also how such trends could be enforced or migrate between classes. With this knowledge, I will demonstrate how vase painting and sculpture were used to control and reinforce women's inferior role in Athenian society. In order to fully understand the interaction of art, women, and patriarchal expectation in ancient Athens, it is important to first understand the complex gender relations between men and women during the classical and Hellenistic periods through a brief discussion of gendered upbringing, sexuality, and lifestyle in the domestic sphere. In classical Athens, the separation of boys and girls began at a young age. Athenian fathers were generally absent from domestic life aside from political or formal events. Therefore, mothers or female family members were expected to perform all tasks related to childrearing and caregiving. Beginning around the age of 6, Athenian boys would attend small private schools and civic gymnasiums. Meanwhile, young girls remained at home with their mothers, and any contact with the opposite sex outside of an immediate family member would become almost entirely forbidden. Most young girls and unmarried women did not attend any form of public education, and their schooling would have been limited to household skills that were typically provided in the home by their mother or female relative. As a result, an unmarried woman would be illiterate and with few trade abilities. Although the exclusion of young girls from public education most likely stemmed from the patriarchal aim to disadvantage women, the complete isolation of young girls from public life can be traced to the necessary maintenance of sexual purity before marriage in a manner that could be both, quote, guarded and demonstrated to the community. Once she reached puberty, a young woman, typically around the age of 13, would be married to an older man of her father or brother's choosing. With the exchange of a dowry, she would cease to be her father's property, and ownership would transfer to her husband. In the rare and shameful circumstance that a woman remained unmarried, she would have two options: join a cult to become a priestess, or become a high-class sex worker known as a hetera. Although both positions would have been considered as a lower caste than that of a married woman, they were integral parts of society. The heterae especially enjoyed some privileges that traditional women were not offered, such as a refined education in music, literature, and the arts to aid in performance and knowledgeable discourse, as well as admittance to the otherwise male-only symposiums. Even in the core aspect of one's sexuality in ancient Greece, women were purposefully disregarded by the patriarchal systems of power. As one can see in scenes from the symposium, sexuality in ancient Greece is what we would modernly deem as fluid, or containing aspects of both homosexual and heterosexual relationships. The red figure Calpis by the Dikaios painter shows young men engaging with heterae in an erotic symposium scene, while the red figure bell crater attributed to the Berlin painter shows an idealized young man named Ganymede on his way home from the symposium after receiving a rooster from his older male lover. The rooster or cock indicates that the relationship between the young man and his lover is of a sexual nature, yet the age and class of the boy would ultimately determine whether this was a relationship of equals or an example of pederasty. Attraction and sex were allowed between all genders, but the power dynamics of sex and love were extremely important in maintaining social class for men. A man could only truly love his equal. Therefore, a man could only engage in a loving relationship with another man of equal social class and similar age. Pederasty was merely a form of lust and ritual, which saw older men exerting their power over young men as a form of mentoring and introduction to formal society. In addition, a basic feature of pederastic code, as it came to be known in the 5th century BCE, was to, quote, solidify the love of boys as an emblem of the ruling class and its ideals, and to devalue the love of women. The pederastic code excluded women and regarded any attachment to them, any lack of enthusiasm for boys, as the symptom of a servile temperament, end quote. In art and in daily life, Athenians separated their concept of the human body into three categories: ideal bodies, boys, military trainees, and adult male citizens; indeterminate bodies, prepubescent girls, virgin maidens, and married women; and non-ideal bodies, older adults, sex workers, servants or slaves, barbarians, and the disabled. The ideal male body canon was established in classical Athens with Polykleitos' creation of the Doryphoros, or spear-bearer. However, the female canon was not introduced until Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Knidos in the early Hellenistic 4th century BCE, and so we must rely on examples of vase painting to understand what the patriarchal expectations of body, dress, and hygiene would have been for women in the classical period, as well as to observe how such imagery and beauty standards would have helped to reinforce women as the other. It is important to note that due to a woman's lack of public education, strict patrilineal inheritance of trade, and the time-consuming expectations of domestic maintenance, it is highly unlikely that women would have been artists in ancient Athens. Thus, all vase paintings and sculptures from ancient Greece are assumed to have been created by men. This gave male artists a unique level of influence over the portrayal and perception of women in classical and Hellenistic Athens. It also solidified the lack of the female viewpoint in ancient Greek artwork in favor of the male gaze and patriarchal expectation. Non-ideal women, such as sex workers, were intentionally portrayed by male artists as animalistic to further the narrative of women as the sexually insatiable other. Meanwhile, the indeterminate woman was expected to view their portrayal in art as a set of guidelines. If women were to be considered attractive or even accepted in society, they needed to follow the rules of dress, grooming, and behavior as shown in the work. Depictions of both the non-ideal and indeterminate women are commonly found in the form of classical vase painting. In ancient Athens, most works of art were functional, thus the pottery that vase painting were found upon were not merely for decoration, but for use in the home and in the symposium. This limitation of painted pottery to the informal or private realm indicates that painted pottery was less important than other forms of art in ancient Greece. However, vase paintings are highly valuable for modern historians seeking to understand the domestic realm of Athenian life. In addition, women would have had regular interaction with painted pottery, meaning they would have been inundated with these images, either negative and othering or highly idealized and showing the expectations for women of the time. In the case of symposium pottery, where the indeterminate woman would not have been allowed in the symposium setting, she likely would have come into physical contact with the cups and their imagery through domestic chores such as cleaning. The depictions of women on these vase paintings tended to be negative, with maenads and heterae as the most frequent images of women on pottery. These images often served as a warning to men and a constant reminder that if not controlled, their wives could easily end up as wild and untamed as the non-ideal woman, therefore bringing shame upon the family and calling into question the legitimacy of future heirs. One example of the suggestive artwork is the tondo of an ancient Greek Attic white ground kylix depicting a Maenad with a snake on her head, circa 490 to 480 BCE. In ancient Greece, the taming of young women was considered essential to their considerations of purity, first by their father and then by their husband. This sense of wild and uncontrolled behavior continues throughout the portrayal of their hair, body, dress, and even hygienic expectations. Once women were married, they were expected to be respectful and express that they had given up their wild manners in favor of the discipline of their husband by wearing their hair in a coiled and refined manner, often shown as a low and tight chignon or bun. In stories of women breaking free or becoming wild in any manner, they are yet again shown with their hair loose and free. Such is the case of the Maenads, or female followers of the god Dionysus, who are regularly portrayed in an animalistic stance or with an animal in order to reiterate the connection between unconventional and wild behavior with the barbaric other. This can be seen in the interior of this white ground cup that depicts a Maenad holding a panther and wearing a snake on her head, while her hair swings erratically and without taming. The Maenad's dress also indicates her sexually provocative and lower class position in society due to her wearing a transparent chiton with only an animal skin worn as a shawl for modest cover. While married women also wore the chiton, they were expected to wear an additional covering, such as a long cloak known as a hematia, in order to preserve their modesty. The idea of maenads reinforced the ancient Greek patriarchal belief that women were, quote, prone to excessive and uncontrolled behavior, and that they were therefore badly in need of male guidance, end quote. Hair, animals, clothing, and action specifically demonstrate the maenad's disobedience, and by controlling these aspects of the woman, a man is taught that he can eliminate the possibility of a woman becoming autonomous or free. In response, a woman shown this image would be trained to recognize all of the facets of body and dress that were unacceptable in order to remain respectable in an otherwise shame-based society. And while the expectation of maintaining a clean and trendy hairstyle as a married woman is not entirely burdensome, especially compared to other traditions that Greek women were expected to adhere to, it does act as a constant indication of one's lowered status in society simply due to their gender. Wearing a chignon not only signified that a woman had been tamed by her husband, but that there was a reason she needed to be disciplined in the first place. Therefore, rather than portraying a joyful image of a freed woman dancing in respect to a god, vase paintings of maenads would have acted as a warning and constant reminder of expectation for both genders. Another common subject of vase painting was the heterae. The tondo of a red figure kylix, attributed to the Nicosthenes painter, showing a nude heterae with phallus circa 520 to 500 BCE, is a fascinating example of the intersection of the male gaze and patriarchal ideology in ancient Greece. This image is important to examine because it shows us three things. First, it reinforces women as the other, outside of the ideal. Second, it gives more fodder to the notion that men must control women to keep their insatiable sexual appetites in check. And third, it shows us what the social expectations for a nude woman's body would have been. Similar to the image of the Maenad, the nude heterae with phallus continues the othering of women through a somewhat vulgar image of a hetera, a woman considered to have the non-ideal body type, holding multiple phalluses in suggestion of both oral and vaginal penetration. While heterae were commonly depicted as nude, proper women would have been painted almost exclusively fully clothed, even in scenes of chasing, abduction, or allusion to rape. Although this image is clearly that of a hetera, it still works to otherize women as a whole by reinforcing the patriarchal idea that women were sexually insatiable and therefore must be controlled by their husbands and limited in the public sphere to prevent a perceivably inevitable infidelity. As seen in the mythological tales of Athena, as well as in the treatment of unmarried girls, ancient Athenians prized virginity in young girls and sexual monogamy for women following marriage. It was considered one of the most important factors of a woman's existence because the transfer of power was entirely dependent on a legitimate patrilineal heir. Therefore, another aspect of the male control over respectable women was focused on the suppression of female sexuality in order to ensure that any children conceived were legitimate. Once again, this image of a hetero with phalluses acts as both a reminder and warning to men that without absolute control over their wives or daughters, they risk succumbing to the shame of possessing an impure woman that would inevitably cost the family both respect and power. Although this hetero's hair is worn properly in a chignon in this tondo, she appears otherwise entirely nude and in an awkward stance, which reveals that outside of cephalic hair, she has removed all body hair, including in her armpits and pubic region. Throughout the period of classical Athens, the typical heteri was expected to uphold a level of complete cleanliness, including in their groin. It is unknown whether or not wives of this time were also expected to comply with the need for depilation of the pubic region, or whether it was reviewed as bawdy or vulgar to be completely bare, such as the heteri were. In the conservative traditions of the classical work, it is possible that the removal of pubic hair was considered an obscene act due to its connotations with the creation of a desirable or sexual woman, something that may have been inappropriate for married housewives and older women until the early Hellenistic period with the introduction of the Aphrodites of Knidos. In opposition to the somewhat commonplace nature of vase paintings, ancient Greek sculpture was held in the highest artistic regard. Perhaps because of this, Athenian sculpture rarely depicted humans outside of friezes or carved scenes of war until the late Hellenistic era, opting instead to dedicate the majority of standalone sculpture to representation of gods and goddesses. The goddess sculptures from classical and Hellenistic Athens are important because they act as a reinforcement of patriarchal control. They present an idealized feminine form that women were expected to imitate. Women would have never been able to achieve such level of perfection because they were not goddesses and were therefore subject to human flaws. In this manner, male artists in ancient Greece were truly able to diminish the female existence by creating an impossible beauty standard as a means of withholding power. Although sculptures of the ideal woman supposedly existed as a form of representation, the most prominent exhibition of the model woman can be found in the execution of 4th century BCE Aphrodite of Knidos, who not only established the first nude female canon, but also became a public figure that was viewable by both men and women. In this sculpture, the audience encounters Aphrodite either immediately preceding or following her ritual bath to restore purity. As she holds her discarded garment in one hand, her other hand seeks to protect her modesty by covering her pubic area. Yet this arrangement of coverage leaves the rest of her body, including her breasts, bared entirely nude for the viewer to observe. In addition, Aphrodite does not meet the viewer's gaze, but rather glances to the side in a coy manner. Either she is inviting the viewer to gaze upon her nakedness without challenge, or she has become distracted by a second viewer, perhaps a lover. Not only was Aphrodite's nudity scandalous as the first widely seen female nude in sculpture in ancient Greece, but the coy nature of her bodily placement that read as both an invitation and a rejection can be, curiously enough, interpreted as the strategy of a hetera engaged in a love triangle. Not only does the Aphrodite of Knidos represent the unattainable beauty and power of a goddess, she simultaneously displays the overt sexuality and charisma of the heteri. To the average middle or upper class wife, the Aphrodite of Knidos would have therefore represented all of the traits that men found desirable while distinctly othering their wives from those qualities. Again, this level of manipulation was yet another method of controlling the beauty standards and behavioral expectations of women in ancient Greece through the female observation of male artistic representation. The popularity of Aphrodite of Knidos would have meant the statue gained a large viewing of both men and women. The increase of public art, which showed goddesses and otherwise respectable women as entirely bare of body hair in the early Hellenistic period, may have changed the connotations surrounding pubic depilation, and therefore if women had not previously been removing the entirety of their body hair, they may have begun doing so during the Hellenistic times. Another theory of whether or not wives practice pubic depilation goes back to the functional medical need for the removal of pubic hair to combat the infestation of pubic lice, which may have been passed between husband and wife if the husband frequently employed the use of a hetera, therefore showing that the heteri did influence the wife's decision to move her hair in a slightly less cordial manner. Overall, unlike the majority of beauty ideals, the migration of bodily grooming habits between classes in ancient Athens is actually traced as a lower class influencing an upper class, or the heteri determining expectations for the domestic sphere. an interesting trend migration that could once again be traced back to the sexual preferences and expectations of husbands, as well as continued female viewership of the nude heterized figure in art such as vase paintings and goddess sculptures. Although classical sculptures and vase paintings provide a significant amount of evidence, the shift of style and representation from classical art in the 6th century BCE to the 4th century BCE, early Hellenistic period, is important for understanding the simultaneously shifting social expectations of women in ancient Athens. In small ways, women gained more autonomy and representation in artwork during the 4th century. This could initially be seen in comparison of classical depictions of the heterae on vase paintings as animalistic through the composed and sensual Aphrodite of Cnidos sculpture in the early Hellenistic era. Following the completion of the perfect nude body for both men and women during the classical period, Hellenistic art no longer relied as heavily on the ideal, and artistic liberties were taken which could, in a way, free women of the idea of unachievable perfection. Another shift in the artistic work of the 4th century BCE, and moving forward, was an expanded interest in the depiction of the other. Not only for indeterminate bodies and heterae, but images of the elderly and the disabled became popular motifs, such as the marble statue of an old woman circa 2nd century BCE. In the Hellenistic period, women became frequent dedicators of statues or offerings, and although they were still not allowed to become artists themselves, the act of commissioning an artifact would have given a woman more control over the subject matter. Another factor in the shifting attitudes towards the representation of women in early Hellenistic Athens was an economic crisis which hit the city following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. Construction of Roman temples stalled alongside a collapse of thriving commercial trade and a drastic decline in both wealth and population. Following a series of successors to the Aphrodite of Cnidos, the halt on constructing temples also led to a decrease in the creation of goddess statues. Instead, and perhaps morbidly, much of the Hellenistic artwork during the 4th century BCE turned to memorial causes, such as mausoleums or funerary sculpture. Surviving grave steles show an important shift in social class, as women were more frequently depicted when Athens moved from the classical to the Hellenistic period, signaling not only an increase in civic importance, but also in societal respect. Further, the depictions of women upon grave steles were no longer limited to either caricature or idealization, but rather presented a formal yet realistic portrayal of an upper-class woman, such as upon the grave stele of Hegeso, circa 4th century BCE. As the fluctuating Hellenistic style proves, the reflection of woman in art was not a stagnant art form, but rather it shifted with the trending societal views of women, reflexively showing the expectations held for women during the 6th through 4th centuries BCE as an echo of the patriarchal opinion. In ancient Athens, from the 6th to 4th centuries BCE, almost all images enforced the restrictive roles and physical appearances of women. The informal vase paintings of classical Athens relied on images of non-ideal women, such as maenads and heterae, to threaten the crude outcome that might befall women who did not follow the conventional rules of dress, grooming, or social interaction. In the transition to formal goddess statues in the late classical and early Hellenistic periods, the representation of women shifted to become less derogatory, but no less othering, as these sculptures worked to normalize impossible beauty standards. Although women gained a more respected social role in late Hellenistic Athens, with artwork that no longer actively exaggerated or distorted the female image, the seeming approval of women remained dependent on the male acceptance of the female existence. Thus, the combination of dress, nudity, accessory, and posing, and even suggested grooming habits all made an impression on both the men and women who viewed the artwork of classical and Hellenistic Greece, reinforcing the social expectations of the male gaze on the female body, and proving that the artwork of ancient Greece was yet another tool used for othering and degradation of women from the 6th to 4th centuries BCE of ancient Athens.